All right, so I'd like to welcome you to the Unlovable Coyotes. This is a webinar designed specifically for educators, but we may have some other people joining us in just a little bit. Before I do any introductions, I want to cover some general housekeeping. For this presentation, you will have noticed that your microphones will be muted. But you will have the ability to interact with me, whether if I ask a question or if you have a question for me or want to provide some feedback. You can do that through one of two ways. There are two different options. You only need to use one of them, but it doesn't matter which one you use. You can either use the chat box on your control panel. I don't know exactly what you can see, but on your control panel, there should be either a chat, something that says chat, or the little chat bubble window, or else there's a Q&A box. Either of those will come to me where I can see the comments and the questions, and so that's how you're going to interact with me. So let's just try this really fast. So if you can hear me and you can, what I want you to do is in your chat, in that chat box, if you'll just tell me where you're listening from, give me an idea of where you're listening from. That'll allow me to see who's on, who can hear me, and where we're listening from. And while those are coming in, I just want to let you know, so again, it looks like most people are able to hear and are getting some of this information. As you put in comments and questions, I'll be monitoring both of these chats. I will be answering the questions throughout, and then at the end, there's going to be time for me to answer some questions as well. But please understand that I'm the only one running this particular webinar, and so there's nobody that's also monitoring the chat in addition to me giving the presentation. So I may fade out for a minute as I'm reading one of the comments or something like that. So just bear with me on that part. If for some reason something happens, you have to leave early, or you lose connection. We've talked about some people that already apparently are trying to log in a couple times to get the sound to work correctly. This presentation is being recorded. I do expect it to go the entire hour. It's jam-packed with content. I really had a hard time cutting down what I wanted to cover in this particular workshop. So we're going to be going right up there. So if for some reason you need to leave early, it's perfectly understandable. It will be recorded and you'll have access to that later on. At the end, there should be a survey that pops up. So when you exit out of this program, there should be a survey. For some people, it doesn't work, and I haven't figured that out yet. So if you don't get it, don't worry about it. But if you do, I would appreciate if you just answer the 5 or 8 questions, whatever's on there, that gives me some feedback on how this webinar went and what we'd like to do in the future. We do monitor those, and we do use those to help us plan moving forward. And then finally, shortly after this presentation ends, about 30 minutes to an hour after this presentation ends, you should receive an automated follow-up email. On that email will be a link. There'll be a couple links. There'll be a link to a website where you will be able to download your certificate for this workshop. So if you are participating in it, one, to get the knowledge, but also to get the professional development credits for your district, for your recertification, that will be in the link that will be provided. In addition, there will be a link to some resources that we'll be talking about. So we're going to focus a lot on coyote content today, information, the natural history, the history of coyotes today, but we'll also be throwing in some ideas for activities you can bring into your classroom or your learning situation, whatever that might be. And so there will be resources that are going to be shared along the way. So that's the general housekeeping. Let me take a quick look here and scan. It looks like we've got people from all over the world listening today. The usual suspects from Tucson. We've got a lot from Phoenix and Tempe and Tucson and Prescott, and I see Santan Valley and Sun Lakes. Payson is represented in Safford, Fountain Hills, but I also see some other places as well. It looks like we have Australia. Somebody's listening from Australia. That's right on. We have Virginia being represented. Good. So lots of people in here. It seems like most of you are able to work. San Francisco is being represented. Good job. This is cool. This is exciting. Chandler, Goodyear, Phoenix, right on. Okay, so let me do a quick little introduction. We'll get started on the presentation because we have a lot of people on here that haven't attended one of my webinars before. If you're not familiar, I work for the Arizona Game and Fish Department. We are the state wildlife agency that is responsible for managing more than 800 wildlife species found in the state. So if that's much more than just the animals that you can hunt or fish. It's all the wildlife that's found in Arizona. It's our job to make sure that the populations are doing okay. We are not your typical government agency in that we do not take any general taxpayer dollars. So there's nothing from your income tax or nothing from your sales tax that comes to us. We operate much more on a user pay model or business model. So it is the users of the resource that are the ones that are paying for it. That's where things like hunting and fishing licenses come in. When you buy a hunting or fishing license, that money is coming directly back to the state for the management of those species. I am operating what's called Focus Wild Arizona, which is our K-12 wildlife education program. So this is a program that provides resources, curriculum, training, those types of things for the K-12 environment. So we provide those educational resources, lessons, those types of things that you can bring into your classroom or your non-formal institution, whatever that might be, to focus on wildlife issues and concepts relevant to us here in Arizona. My name is Eric Proctor. I'm the Wildlife Education Coordinator, so I kind of oversee Focus Wild Arizona. In that role, I like to tell people I kind of work behind the scenes, so I don't go into classrooms a lot. Right now, nobody's going into classrooms, but I don't go into classrooms a lot. Most of what I do is working behind the scenes with you guys as educators. So I do a number of these types of presentations and programs and workshops to provide you with the tools and resources that you might need to bring these into the classroom. And I also do curriculum development and those types of things. So that's enough about the introductions. Just again, a reminder for those that might have been joining us later, you will be interacting through the chat or the Q&A box. Either of those work. So if you have a question at all during this presentation, feel free to put them into the chat box, and I will be monitoring those as best I can to make sure that we get all of those answered as much as possible. And at the end, I'll go through and make sure that I'll scan all the questions and make sure that I've gotten all of them. But let's go ahead and get here for what you are basically here for. I want to talk about kind of where the inspiration for this webinar came from. This is part of a webinar series that we started earlier this year called the Unlovables. We've offered 2 of them already, one on bats and one on vultures. We're actually going to be re-offering those in the coming weeks as well. So if you enjoyed this one and you didn't get to catch our bats or our vultures one, we're going to be offering those in the next 2 weeks, same time, one each of these following Tuesdays. The initial idea came from a book that I think is now out of print. There you can see it on the right hand side there, called Animals Nobody Loves. It's by a famous natural history writer called Ronald Rood. It was kind of an interesting book, and the premise was he focused each chapter on a different animal that people tend to not like, and it could be because of the way they look, because of the way they act, or whatever it is. And he focused a chapter on just kind of talking about those animals from an interesting perspective. And so I always thought that that'd be an interesting webinar series to take some of these animals that some people like. Let's be clear, there's a lot of people that do appreciate coyotes and bats and vultures, but of those animals that are out there, these are some of the ones that probably get the least amount of appreciation. And so to share some of that information, to maybe share some of their natural history so we can gain a better appreciation for some of these animals and understand where those animals are at, where we are at with our management of them. A lot of the content from this workshop is coming from a book that I completed recently called Coyote America by Dan Flores, who's written a lot of things. In addition, I've utilized a lot of other research articles, a lot of primary source documents like original journals and things like that to put a lot of this information together. So let's take a look. And I'm going to begin with a little experience that I had about a week ago. So these are some baby geese. I live in an area of Phoenix where urban area where there's ponds and those types of things throughout our neighborhood. And recently we noticed that there were some baby geese. There's this family, there's 2 adults and these 4 baby geese that you see here. Well, so I saw this one day. I went back later that night, and you're gonna have to excuse the next few pictures. I'm not a professional photographer by any means, and I was experimenting with our camera at night, trying to get an idea. And so this is what we saw. This is what I picked up at night. Same location. You can see that there's one adult. There's 2 adult geese that you can see there in the picture. And I was just trying to experiment with my camera. I wasn't trying to do anything interesting. I looked down at my camera to see if I got the picture taken or anything like that. And then all of a sudden I saw this gray streak run by. Could barely see anything, but I saw the gray streak run by. So I just shoved the camera up. I was having trouble focusing it. And this is what I saw next. This is what I was able to take a picture of next. Same exact area. You can now see that there's this animal on the right hand side there, which is glowing, which turns out to be a coyote. And then it had scared the geese into the pond. And they're floating in the pond, but clearly it was trying to get some food. And so and so I was intrigued, and I was like, oh my gosh, I just saw a coyote, how perfect it fits in with the workshop I'm going to be offering in a week or so. So I took the pictures. I ran home real fast to see how well they came out. You can see that they didn't come out great, but I share this because almost everyone has a coyote story. Estimates are that every person is within 1 mile of a resident coyote. It has become our most common large mammal encounter. As such, I'm going to focus my presentation on the intertwined relationship that coyotes and humans have had throughout most of our time on Earth. I believe that you cannot tell the story of coyotes in North America without highlighting the role that humans have played in shaping that history. The coyote we encounter in our neighborhood, like the one that was going after the geese, is there because of its evolutionary history, which includes human actions. Now, before I get too far, I want to kind of put an end to that story that I just shared with you, and understand that when I went back the next morning, I was eager to see what had happened, if the coyote had been successful, and all 4 of those babies are still alive. They're still around. I've gone back since then, and they're still floating around, and they're still there. So the coyote in this case was not successful in getting his food source, but it just shares an interesting situation that many of us experience. And I did have a couple questions in here about, just to take a pause real fast. People are asking about when they can get information about the bats and the vultures webinar. There's going to be a slide at the end where I'm going to share that with you, and then I will make sure that I send a follow-up email as well. In addition to the automated email that you're going to get, I will send a personal email out to everyone that participated with just some follow-up information, and on that will be the webinars for the bats and the vultures if you're interested in participating a little bit. And I'm getting some comments coming through that people have had similar experience with the coyotes, and that's good to hear, and hopefully that'll come out as you learn about the coyotes a little bit today. We often describe coyotes as America's little wolf, and they certainly share a large evolutionary history with wolves and other canines across the world. But there are some differences that separate coyotes and wolves, and it may be those differences that have connected coyotes and humans through time. The things that separate wolves and coyotes are the same things that we share with coyotes. Like us, coyotes are a cosmopolitan species. In biological terms, that means that they are especially flexible regarding habitats they can live in. More specifically, they are considered synanthropic. These are creatures that thrive in the ecosystems created by urban developments. Humans, rodents, and coyotes are all excellent examples of creatures that have learned to survive and thrive in an urban setting. Finally, we share a unique behavioral adaptation that is not seen through much of the animal kingdom, called fission fusion. It is a form of flexible sociality. They can either be pack-like or solitary as the conditions warrant. This instills both selfish impulses as well as altruistic or cooperative ones. They can be pack animals to take larger prey like deer or to defend themselves against larger predators like wolves, but they can also be solitary, focusing on small mice, rabbits, insects, and plants. Wolves, on the other hand, do not have this flexibility. They evolved as highly specialized pack hunters to pursue large prey. Interestingly enough, coyotes also lack many of the facial expressions that wolves do for this very same reason. The coyotes don't need those facial expressions because they don't exist solely in packs, so they don't need that communication. As wolves were wiped out or extirpated across the landscape, coyotes were able to use this fission fusion behavior to fill that niche. Under normal circumstances, coyotes eat smaller prey. That's the niche they fill. But with wolves gone, they started to form packs in order to hunt larger prey and take over the niche that the wolves were in. So this leads to a very simple activity. And like I said, I'm going to interject some activities you can potentially do, just some ideas for some activities. This is an activity that can get your kids thinking about the differences and similarities between coyotes and wolves. To make it more personal, I would add humans to your Venn diagram. Of course, the purpose of this would not be to make the argument that coyotes are closely related to humans, because that is not the case. They are more closely related to wolves. But it would allow the students to better connect with coyotes because they might be able to recognize familiar behaviors that the coyotes are exhibiting. So just a very simple introductory activity to get your kids started to think about, how are coyotes and wolves similar and different to each other, and how are those two species similar or different to humans, is going to be an interesting way and a cool way to engage your students a little bit. All right, so let's step back and take a look at the relationship between coyotes and other canines. The earliest written record of a coyote goes back to 1651. Francisco Hernandez described what he called an Indian fox. More than 100 years later, another explorer also described it using the same name that the natives were using. Joseph Whitehouse was one of the members of the Lewis and Clark expedition, and he described the coyote as a prairie wolf. In fact, there are accounts of the prairie wolf throughout the Lewis and Clark documents. It is worth noting, however, that they didn't actually see one until they were halfway across the country into the Great Plains. They first thought it was a fox until they started seeing more of them and had the chance for more observations. Thomas Say was a zoologist for Stephen Long's exploration of the Rocky Mountains and the Missouri River. He provided a detailed description of the coyote. And then later, we start to see the name evolve. We moved away from calling it a prairie wolf, which was a reference that basically Lewis and Clark had created, into something more like what we use today. And you can see how it evolved. Albert Pike started trying to make English a version of what he was seeing from the natives and from the Spanish. And then Josiah Gregg was the first one to actually use the term coyote in written text. In fact, it appears that one of the last references to prairie wolf may have been by Herman Melville in his book Moby Dick. With all of these sightings and records of coyotes, the honor of actually introducing it to the scientific world and getting credit for the discovery actually goes to Thomas Say. So even though there were observations before him, Thomas Say is the one who got credit for it. He was the one who provided the most detailed observations, and this part was the key. He also provided a binomial scientific name in the Linnaean classification system. He called it Canis latrans, which you can see up there. This, which is the name we still use today. He actually argued that this was a species new to science as opposed to a type of jackal which had been proposed earlier. And this is a look at the description he included in his official report, so you can get an idea of the level of detail that he put into there. As with many things in science, the naming and classification wasn't without controversy. There were two general schools of thought. There was the Philadelphia Academy. These had been some of the early American explorers, including Say, who got credit for naming them. They believed the coyote was indeed an entirely new species, something we hadn't seen before. It wasn't like anything else. Then there was the Smithsonian scientists. These came around a little bit later. They were involved in some of the later expeditions like the Border Survey, following the Gadsden Purchase and the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Woodhouse, who accompanied Sitgreaves on his expedition of Zion and Colorado rivers, was one of the leaders of this school of thought. They believed that the coyote was actually a type of jackal, not unlike the golden jackals found in Europe. In the end, however, the Philadelphia Academy won out, and we consider the coyote to be different than the jackals. It isn't just another jackal, it is its own species. So it's related, but not the same species that we're seeing, the same type of animal that we're seeing in all these other places. Canine evolution in general is very confusing and involves multiple species crossing in and out of North America multiple times across land bridges. We'll try to touch ever so briefly on coyotes. We're not going to get into a ton of detail on how many times wolves came back and forth and what that meant. We're just going to keep this very simple. So canines in general likely evolved in the American Southwest around 5.3 million years ago. There are numerous fossil records in different locations that show canines being in this area. About 2 million years later, gray wolves and coyotes split off from a common ancestor. There is about a 4% genetic difference between coyotes and gray wolves, which is about the same as humans and orangutans. Then, 2 million years after that, jackals and coyotes separated. So they do have a common ancestor. They are just different species. Golden jackals and coyotes are the closest, again, with about a 4% genetic difference. Around that same time that those two species were separating out, conditions in North America were changing. They were starting to favor smaller, quicker canine species. Then, around 10,000 years ago, the Pleistocene extinctions took out 32 genera, including all of those famous large animals we have become fascinated with: mammoths, saber-toothed cats, and yes, even dire wolves, one of the large canines that roam the continent. Gray wolves and coyotes survived that extinction. But coyotes couldn't compete for the same resources that the gray wolves did, so they continued to evolve, becoming scavengers and omnivores. Authors of a recent report state interactions among carnivores and their prey are the probable cause of evolutionary change in coyotes. So this competition with gray wolves was likely the reason why the coyotes shifted, became smaller, and became omnivorous and scavengers. So the niche of a coyote-sized predator can be found across the world. Africa has wild dogs. Europe and the Middle East have jackals, as we've talked about. Australia has the Tasmanian devil and now the wild dingoes. And North America has the coyote. They all fill the same niche in their particular environments. There are only about 7 or 8 animals that are faster than the coyote. Even so, wolves can outrun them in open areas. So coyotes try to engage wolves in forested or hilly settings where their smaller, more agile bodies allow them to dodge and weave better. Evolving in the niche below wolves, coyotes grew wary and cautious. They were never top dog. As such, they don't have the cockiness of wolves. This played out later when we tried to kill them. Coyotes have also adapted some unique reproductive strategies. If an alpha female is killed, then lower ranking females can come into estrus early to be able to reproduce sooner. In addition, they can adjust their litter size for the conditions. An average coyote litters just under 6 pups, but it can range between 2 and 19. If conditions are stable and they have reached a carrying capacity, they will have smaller litter sizes. However, during colonization periods into new territories, or when they are feeling threatened, they will have larger litter sizes. Some believe that their famous howl, that howl at the moon that the coyotes are known for, is actually a way for them to assess the size of the surrounding population. I always think that that's kind of cool that they're using it in some ways to communicate, but also to see where else are the coyotes so that they can get an idea of how big it is. And then biologically, they can shift their reproductive behavior. As mentioned, when settlers started to arrive in North America, the coyote was mostly an open space animal restricted to the Southwest, but human activities helped them expand. Agriculture opened up lands and provided new, easy food sources, pushing the coyotes south down into Central America. Later, the fur trade pushed them north as they feasted on the dead horses and mules that were left behind during the fur trade. Finally, the campaign to remove wolves from the landscape provided new opportunities for the coyotes to move east. In the 4 centuries since settlers arrived on the continent, coyotes have exponentially increased their range and could now be found in every habitat type from tropical jungle to frozen tundra. Only one other large mammal has shown as dramatic of a range increase. Can you name it? Why don't you tell me what other mammal has shown such a dramatic range increase? We're getting some guesses coming in. All right, so we got some good guesses, and most people are getting in here. We're throwing out some, this is kind of a tricky one. This is actually humans. Humans are the only other large mammal that has shown this same type of range expansion. Yet another thing that we as humans share with the coyotes. Remember that entwining history that we have with each other. We've talked about the settlers, but what about some of the earlier people? How did they view the coyotes? The Aztec culture is rich with coyote references, and I'm gonna butcher these names. Probably you have them in front of you. I apologize, but Coyotl was a god they honored by wearing coyote skins and headdresses. Their moon goddess was named after the wild dog that howls at the moons, and Old Coyote was their trickster. The idea of a trickster exists in mythologies throughout time and across the world. Just some of the examples of trickster idols: there's a deer in Indonesia, there's a spider in West Africa, and perhaps most familiar to people today, thanks to a popular movie series, is Loki, a Norse god. He's known as a trickster. Across America, however, coyote repeatedly comes up as the trickster icon of choice. So there are all these animals that are representing Trickster, but in America, there are a few differences. But for the most part, Coyote is the one that comes up as Trickster. And it's worth noting that one of our listeners just said while they're listening to this presentation, 3 coyotes just went right through their right at their office, right outside their bedroom window while they're listening. All right. So this idea of perceptions and legends leads us to another activity. You can have students explore these tricksters in general, have them look at trickster gods from a variety of cultures and compare them. Or, and this would be my choice probably, is have students look at a different one in detail. So you assign, or the students can pick out a different icon of a different culture that has a trickster god or a trickster myth, and then have them research that animal. And why was that? Why, and kind of come to conclusions on why do they think that animal was chosen to be a trickster? Why did they feel that that one was a trickster? What were the characteristics of it? And then you could have each of those students share out ideas or share their particular mythology, and they can look for similarities between the animals that were chosen and so on. So again, just another quick idea to integrate some of the stuff we've been talking about. Let's go ahead and continue. And again, I'm going to move pretty quickly through this because I've got a full slate of stuff that we're going to be covering today. But Coyote is so much more than a trickster for so many cultures. He is the earliest recorded god in North America, and he appears in more stories across multiple tribes through time than any other animal, and it isn't even close. Coyote was not merely a beast in these tales. He was one of the first people, ancient characters who walked among the gods in olden times. For the Crow people, Coyote was even the first worker. He was the creator of the world and its creatures. In the Llanos culture in California, he created death, and he did so for 2 reasons. One was to stop overpopulation and the destruction of the earth, and 2 was that so people would appreciate being alive. Yet, when he himself, the coyote, experienced death of a loved one, he begins to doubt the idea that death is actually a really good thing. And this is one of those characteristics that we see of Coyote in general, is he's never sort of pleased with the way things are. And the Navajo people, they called Coyote simply God's dog. In a land where some humans coexisted with dynamic megafauna that we've talked about, like mammoths and dire wolves and saber-toothed cats, why did the coyote hold such a place of reverence for these people? As anthropologist Lewis Hyde says, the coyote exhibits a great plasticity of behavior and is therefore a consummate survivor in a shifting world. In short, the coyote survived when all those other animals did not. In addition to survivability and adaptability, it appears that some native tribes may have seen a little of ourselves in the coyote, a point that I've already been making. In many stories, the coyote god personifies humanity. He is both good and bad. He's admirable, inspirational, imaginative, and energetic, while also vain, deceitful, and self-serving. He's extremely lustful. In fact, if you're going to bring coyote stories into your classroom, make sure you read them ahead of time, because some have a surprising amount of references to sex and genitalia and other things like that. Coyote was obsessed with those types of things. For Coyote, he is never satisfied with the way things are. And as you think about the people around you and our comparisons between people and coyotes, do those characteristics sound like anybody we know? You may even see yourself in some of those. Again, this is probably what was drawing those native people to this idea of sharing the coyote and having so much reverence for the coyote. While many of the early explorers and settlers didn't revere the coyote in quite the same way the native cultures did, they also didn't despise it the way some do today. Most of these early accounts of coyotes are indifferent, almost scientific. As stated earlier, many were just confused. People just didn't quite know what to make of the coyote, and that comes out. And you can see here's a couple examples here. I'm not going to read through all of them, but you can see there's not a distaste for the coyote, but there's not any like huge reverence. This is what we were seeing from the early settlers. The coyote was there. They were confused by it. They didn't know what to make of it, but it wasn't this evil thing that had to be done away with. But that all changed when a somewhat famous author put the coyote in his sights. In his 1872 work, Roughing It, Mark Twain did not hold back on his distaste for the coyote. And this view would become the dominant narrative for generations. You can see and hear his use of language. The coyote is a long, slim, sick, and sorry-looking skeleton with a gray wolf skin stretched over it, a tolerably bushy tail that forever sags down with a despairing expression of forsakenness and misery, a furtive and evil eye, and a long, sharp face with slightly lifted lip and exposed teeth. He has a slinking expression. He's the living, breathing allegory of want. He's always hungry. He's always poor. He's out of luck, friendless. The meanest creatures despise him, and even the fleas would desert him. He's spiritless and cowardly. Oops, we wanted to go back real fast. Well, we won't bother going back. Even the world's most famous cartoon coyote was inspired by this description. Wile E. Coyote first appeared on TV in September 1949. The creators acknowledged that they modeled his appearance on Twain's description. Simple cartoon very well could have shaped ideas of coyotes for youth across the country. Even the comedic scientific names the animators used didn't portray the coyote in a positive light. Grotescus appetitus, Carnivorus vulgaris, Augeus ignorami. These are just some of the harsh names given to Wile E. Coyote throughout the running of the cartoon. It was clear the perception had changed. Around the same time that Twain was roughing it, others were helping shape a negative view of the coyote. Cowardly became a common refrain, while others, like Edwin Sabin, just plain thought it was the worst varmint in the world. The perception stuck. A survey from Yale in the 80s put the coyote dead last in a list of animals that the public appreciated, behind even cockroaches. A study of Canadian newspapers showed that coyotes were regularly portrayed negatively as depraved invaders without a soul. Yet it is not quite clear why this hatred toward coyotes existed or even exists today. A recent study showed that there are an average of 3 people bitten per year by coyotes. By comparison, there are about 300,000 dog bites per year. But dogs hold a different level of reverence in society than coyotes do. This, of course, leads to another activity idea. Students can look at the written accounts of coyotes through time and look for trends and patterns. What do they notice? Can they hypothesize why different people at different times viewed coyotes differently? I'm actually in the process of turning this into a more formal activity. I'm putting some of these together so you don't have to do the work. It's just not ready quite yet, where these are going to be in a worksheet and your kids can look at how they interpret it. How is the coyote being portrayed by these different people? In the meantime, however, these are some of the people you can search for coyote accounts and put them together on your own. But I'm going to be working on that in the very near future, and I'll be sending that out as soon as it's done. So earlier we talked about the huge range expansion of coyotes, but there was one place that coyotes had yet to go, and that was the cities. For about 15,000 years, coyotes have been living in and among humans. They were common among native villages, and they even hung out regularly at the campsites of our earliest explorers. On a side note, since we're talking about the native villages, there was a question that came up here where somebody was saying, do they think that after dogs, are coyotes the next canine that could become a pet like the dog, domesticated? And what's interesting to note is the Native Americans, most of them did not choose to domesticate coyotes. They did domesticate wolves in some cases, and they domesticate some other animals, but because of the level of appreciation they had for coyotes and the respect they had for it, they chose not to domesticate coyotes. Now, that doesn't mean that the coyotes lived near the villages and those types of things, but for some reason, there's not really accounts of them domesticating coyotes at the same level that they were some other animals. They were common among native villages, and they even hung out regularly at the campsites of our earliest explorers, yet they couldn't get into town until the middle of the 19th century. Why? The reason is simple. Dogs. It is hard to imagine today, but loose and feral dogs were a regular part of everyday life in America's earliest cities. We tolerated them without even knowing that they were actually keeping the coyotes at bay. Then in the 1840s, there was a rash of rabies incidences in some of our urban centers. This resulted in a number of new laws and regulations that were being passed in an attempt to get the dog problem under control. Leash laws were passed, and dog pounds and dog catchers were brought in to take care of those unclaimed dogs. It was a success, and the cities largely got rid of the feral dog problem. And that was enough for the coyote. With the regular ingenuity that they had showed with their earlier range expansions, coyotes began to fill the vacuum left when the dogs were removed. They had some help. Train tracks provided corridors into the inner city, while natural space movements created parks that provided areas of refuge. In cities, coyotes found plenty of prey. Mice were plentiful, as the exotic roof rats. Plus, geese and ducks are common. You saw a picture of the geese that I shared at the beginning. That is one of their prey bases. Despite anecdotes and news reports, however, studies have indicated that trash, pet food, and other human food is not really a major diet component. These make up only about 2% of their diet. So what about cats and other dogs? We hear all the time about cats being attacked and dogs being attacked. Well, research seems to indicate that pets are also less than 2% of an urban coyote's diet. As Stanley Gert, a preeminent coyote researcher, says, if coyotes were relying on pets as a source of food, we couldn't have any pets left. This is not to say that pets aren't in danger. It is believed that coyotes view cats and dogs as intra-guild predators, competition for similar food sources. Coyotes are trying to rid their territories of this competition. It is worth noting, however, as a little bit of an aside, that when coyotes do take out cats, we find an increase in songbird survivability. Coyotes adapted to an urban lifestyle. The average coyote in a rural area has a home range of 17 square kilometers. In Los Angeles and Chicago, two of America's largest cities, the average home range of a coyote is 5 square kilometers. So 17 square kilometers in the country, 5 square kilometers in the city. This shows that the cities are providing a much more resource-rich environment where they can have denser populations. Coyotes are also learning to adapt to traffic conditions. In Chicago, where coyotes are a relatively newer resident, about 60% of coyote deaths come from cars. 60%, over half of coyotes die because of cars. In LA, however, where they've had a much longer history of being there, they've reduced that number to 40%. So they're learning how to adapt and move away from cars, specifically going into nocturnal where there's a lot less traffic. In rural Illinois, only 13% of coyote pups survive to maturity. 13% of babies become adults. In the city of Chicago, though, that number is a startling 61%. 61% of coyote pups survive in the city compared to 13% in the rural areas. That number, that 61%, is similar to survivability numbers in preserved areas like national parks. Get why I'm talking about how the history of coyotes and where they are today is interesting, is tied in directly with human behavior and human actions. So Paula asked, where are we getting some of these stats? Can we provide the references? Absolutely. At the end, you're going to see some, at the email you're going to get, there's going to be a link to some information. I haven't got it all up there, but a lot of these are coming from some research reports that I've been going through. I'm still going through a number of them, but I'm going to provide PDFs to a lot of them as I have access to them. So thank you. All right, okay. While accounts of coyotes running around eastern towns still makes news and is still surprising, it shouldn't really surprise people. These are just some of the famous coyote encounters we have seen recently. The ones in white are all places in New York, a place where many still view the coyote as a strange invader. But you can see going back to 1946, there have been coyotes found in New York. The 1995 one that was found in Van Cortlandt Park is actually honored by a statue in that same park. There's been a number that are in Central Park. There was actually one that went into a Quiznos in Chicago. Jessica Simpson's dog was snatched up by one. There was one in 2012, the I-80 hitchhiker. That was one where the person actually hit the coyote with a car. The coyote survived and actually rode inside the grill of the car all the way to California before the driver realized that the coyote was still alive in the car. And then there's the rooftop bar one where the coyote was actually found on the rooftop and then escaped by jumping through a broken window, almost like a movie. These urban encounters are getting more common, and evidence does seem to show that people are adjusting. In 2001, Chicago homeowners listed coyotes as the single greatest threat to their safety. Chicago, not gangs, not burglars, coyotes were the biggest threat. At least that's what they perceived. More recently, however, these figures are dropping. Eventually, people get used to coyotes as their neighbors, and the fear begins to subside. But this could be a problem in and of itself. New research seems to indicate that a new urban culture may be developing in our coyote populations. They've started to lose fear and are becoming bolder. Remember the wary coyote who existed in the wolf's shadow. That may be changing right in our cities. Denver has recently seen an uptick in aggressive behavior in coyotes. And there are some tragic incidences that have occurred. The first recorded incident of a human in North America dying from a coyote attack was a toddler in Glendale, California in 1981. In response to that killing, authorities captured and killed all the coyotes they could find in the area. It was somewhat surprising to the neighborhood when they found 53 coyotes. And it was almost 30 years later before we had our first documented adult being killed by coyotes. In this case, a musician decided to take a walk through a national park in Nova Scotia. When she was found, numerous coyotes were scavenging her body. So Marissa asked, what do they mean by aggressive behavior? So usually, a lot of times it doesn't necessarily have to be an attack in this case. I'd have to go back and read the research report, the Denver one. A lot of times it's just sort of maybe they're not fleeing like they should be fleeing, that they could be showing aggression, they could be showing their teeth, various things like that. But some of it could be attacks. In Denver, they are seeing an increase in the pet attacks and those types of things. And yes, that is considered, in the case of that particular study, was considered an aggressive behavior. Whether coyotes are a more significant threat to humans and other wildlife is not entirely clear. What matters, however, is perception. For many, perception is reality. And the perception was that coyotes were no good. As a result, the US government began a war on coyotes. It was part of a much larger war on predators in general. This started with bounties. Individual states were willing to pay for each and every large mammalian predator killed. States were first focused on wolves, but they soon added coyotes to their bounty system, especially as wolves started to decline, and it appeared that the system might be working. In Montana, they killed 23,575 wolves in 1889. By 1920, they only got 17. Yet they didn't see the same declines in coyotes. From 1883 to 1928, Montana averaged 30,000 coyotes a year that they paid out in bounties. That never went down. So wolves went from 23,000 to 17. Coyotes averaged about 30,000 a year. By 1914, states were paying $1 million a year in bounties with an average of $1 per animal, and the plurality of those was coyotes. Around that same time, the federal government got involved. They converted their chief science agency, the U.S. Biological Survey, over to predator control. The mission was to eliminate animals that were considered a threat to agriculture and some other human needs. By 1926, they were so successful that they were rarely killing more than a single wolf a year. So they changed their focus to coyotes. And poison became their weapon of choice. The country was not only killing predators during some of this time, we were also killing off bison in startling numbers. We were doing this beforehand, but it was still taking place a little bit. And all those dead bison became feeding grounds for scavengers, like coyotes. By baiting these carcasses with poison, we could kill many coyotes at a time. As the country moved more to automobiles, we had a similar problem with horses. As they were no longer as important for individual transportation, the country found it had a surplus of horses. Similar bait stations could be set up with horse carcasses. Strychnine, which was synthesized from the seeds of a specific tree, was cheap, easy to produce, and widely available. You could basically go down to the hardware store and buy strychnine. There was a problem with strychnine and the strategy, however. Coyotes began to figure it out. It killed so quickly that coyotes began to associate the carcasses with the food, and they started to avoid them. We started to experiment with newer poisons, some the direct result of World War II. Some of these poisons you can see there included sodium fluoroacetate, thallium sulfite, cyanide. The advantage of these newer poisons is they didn't kill as quickly as strychnine did. So the coyotes would die away from the carcasses that they were feeding on, and the coyotes couldn't make the connection to the food source and the poison. So did it work? According to U.S. Biological Survey's own numbers, they put out millions of bait stations and ended up killing up to 6.5 million coyotes over a 26-year period. They don't know the exact number because they were able to count, I believe, about that 3.5 million that they actually killed at the bait stations, but they estimate there could have been an additional 3 million that were killed that they never found the bodies of. That's their estimates. But it wasn't enough. They weren't seeing the results they had with wolves and other predators. They were still killing that many on a regular basis. They weren't seeing a decline. New research from some studies going on more recently seemed to indicate that a 70% reduction in coyote population year after year results in no appreciable effect on their population density. 70%. The stress actually keeps the coyotes in a constant colonization state with increased litter sizes, something biologists term predator release. Even at 75% annual reduction, it would take 50 years to eliminate coyotes. So you'd have to get to 75% of their population, and it would still take you 50 years to get rid of them. Of course, all of these poisons were indiscriminate, meaning they didn't just kill the target animals. They would kill rodents, prairie dogs, etc. As this is the main prey source for coyotes, and that started to decline, they had to look at other options. Sheep became a new target. Also, by killing the more experienced coyotes with some of these poisons, the younger coyotes began to take over. And those sheep became easy targets for these inexperienced hunters who hadn't had time to learn from their adults. So in our attempt to make things better for ranchers, we may have accidentally sent coyotes in their direction. Alternatives have been tried. Some sterilization techniques have been discussed or attempted. However, they either couldn't get support from the public or they just didn't work. Aerial gunning had actually been around for some time, but it became a bigger factor as concerns about the poisons grabbed hold. And somebody mentioned that they had pygmy goats. Renee mentioned that they had pygmy goats that were attacked by coyotes, and our neighbors had lost 2 dogs. And this is that same idea, is that they've learned in some cases to take some of the easier targets. All right. Evidence was starting to come out about the impacts of landscape scale poisoning campaigns. Rachel Carson, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with, of course, wrote Silent Spring looking at the impact of DDT. But around the same time, another scientist, Arthur Carhart, was focused specifically on the impact of the government's poisoning of coyotes. In addition, sporting and hunting magazines like Field and Stream and Sports Illustrated started running articles on these government poisoning campaigns. Even earlier than that, major science organizations had begun questioning our ideas about predators. In 1914, the Ecological Society of America started looking at the role of predators in the ecosystem. Up to this point, we had been feeling that predators weren't necessary. Let's get rid of them and it'll be better overall for the deer, for the people, all of that stuff. But the Ecological Society started questioning that. 10 years later, the American Society of Mammalogists began similar debates at their meetings. That same year, in 1924, noted biologist Joseph Grinnell developed the concept of ecological niches. This idea that every organism fits into a specific place and has a job in the ecosystem. Now, predators had a place in the ecosystem that was important to the balance of nature. Even the founder of the entire field of wildlife management, Aldo Leopold, who had been a proponent of predator controls, changed his mind. He now started to realize that predators had a role. Then in 1961, Walt Disney entered into the debate. The Coyote's Lament was an animated cartoon as part of the popular Walt Disney Presents series. It told the story of a family of coyotes, highlighting the positive role they have in the ecosystem. This was followed by many other pro-coyote cartoons, including Chico the Misunderstood Coyote and A Country Coyote Goes Hollywood. all designed to move kids and their parents' impression of a coyote away from the one penned by Mark Twain 100 years earlier. Richard Nixon was a lot of things, but one thing he wasn't was ignorant of the politics around the coyote issue. He had been taking in all of this discourse that had been occurring years before he was president, from the beginning of the 1900s all the way to what he was facing as a president. Then on February 8th, 1972, he addressed Congress. And this is what he said. This is the environmental awakening. It marks a new sensitivity of the American spirit and a new maturity of American public life. Americans today set high value on the preservation of wildlife. The old notion that the only good predator is a dead one is no longer acceptable, as we understand that even the animals and birds, which sometimes prey on domesticated animals, have their own value in maintaining the balance of nature. The widespread use of highly toxic poisons to kill coyotes and other predatory animals and birds is a practice which has been a source of increasing concern to the American public and to the federal officials responsible for the public lands. Certainly, predators can represent a threat to sheep and some other domesticated animals, but we must use more selective methods of control that will preserve ecological values while continuing to protect livestock. This was immediately followed by, quote, I am today issuing an executive order barring the use of poisons for predator control on all public lands, exceptions will be made only for emergency situations. I also propose legislation to shift the emphasis of the current direct federal predator control program to one of research and technical and financial assistance to the states to help them control predator populations by means other than poisons, unquote. This speech would lay the groundwork for the Endangered Species Act, which was the first time in history that other species' right to exist was legislated. Almost done here, so wrap it up. I'm gonna show another activity here that you can do, and this one we actually have, and I will be making sure that this is available to you. Students can actually create research major environmental dates and milestones. This can include legislation like the Endangered Species Act that we just talked about, or the publication of books like Aldo Leopold's Sand County Almanac, which has a famous essay about his predator management beliefs. Then they can look at those events in relation to each other and in the context of other events that were happening. What influenced these events? Why do we see certain environmental things happening at certain times? Was there things that were happening before that? And then what did those events influence? We actually have a version of this activity in our high school curriculum called America's Wildlife. You can find it on our education website, but I will make sure that it is included in the follow-up emails. It's actually lesson 3 of that curriculum. It's a 5-lesson curriculum in there that you'll be able to have access to, and it's free. You can download it right off of our website. Of course, the story isn't over. Coyotes would continue to be a political issue for the decades to come. Even today, there isn't a simple solution. We know that we can't get rid of coyotes. They do serve an important role in our ecosystem. Plus, their adaptability has proven them to be survivors. Even when an entire nation was focused on eliminating them from the landscape, they survived. But we also know they can be problematic. Their increasing boldness in urban settings is certainly troubling. Are we at the beginning of a new phase in coyote evolution, one that could make them the predator we feared all along? Who knows? But one thing is clear. In order to coexist with America's little wolf, then we will need to understand them. As I conclude, I am reminded of some advice I was given by one of our wildlife managers a few years back. He said, if you hate coyotes, then you need to be mean to them. But if you love coyotes, then you need to be mean to them. If coyotes continue to lose their fear of people and become aggressive, then public safety calls for specific actions to be taken. Those problem coyotes will be removed, and oftentimes that will be a lethal removal. Preventing problems with wildlife is much simpler and less aggravating than dealing with the problems after they occur. Fortunately, taking a few simple steps can help you prevent many of the most common wildlife-related problems around your home. Removing potential food, water, and shelter. That's one of the biggest ones. These animals don't need our food, and when they get accustomed to it, that's when they start to become problems. Keeping cats and dogs contained indoors or under your eye is another way. Scaring off coyotes by making loud noises or spraying them with a hose, hazing them, making it uncomfortable for them to be around people. All of these will help the coyotes keep a healthy awareness toward people. So with that, I would like to thank you for listening. If you have any questions, please feel free to put them into the chat or the Q&A boxes. And while I wait for questions, I'm going to talk about some of the upcoming workshops and some of the next steps. If you need to run, I understand. You should receive an email shortly with the link to your certificate. So if you have questions, go on and put them in. I do know that there have been some questions that have come through. So I'm going to take a look at those in just a minute, but while the people are writing some more, I'm just going to go through some stuff. First of all, if you want more, this is actually, there are coyote resources that I'm in the process of adding on our main website, which is azgft.gov/focuswild. That is the education page. Under there, there's a themes tab. Right now, the themes tab is focused on wolves, but I'm in the process of making it a canines theme. And so there's going to be wolf resources and coyote resources. I apologize, I just haven't gotten to that part yet. I suspect in the next couple days, I will have that in the coyote information uploaded in there. And that's where you're going to get a lot of the research reports that I talked about, where a lot of this information came from. Also, if you want to stay in touch, we have a Facebook page. That's where you can see some information where we update on more webinars we're going to have. If we release a new resource, that's going to be up there. You can also sign up for education newsletter. You can go to the main Game and Fish website, and then you can click on the sign up for e-news, and there's like 10 or 15 different options you can sign up for. One of those is the educator one. If you're interested in the upcoming webinars, here's some information. And again, you'll get this in a follow-up email as well. I'm offering 2 different types of webinars over the next couple of weeks. On Tuesdays at 7, which is this time frame, is kind of where we're focusing on wildlife and management of Arizona right now. That is focused on this Unlovable series. So on May 12th, a week from today, we're doing the Unlovable bats. And on May 19th, 2 weeks from today, we're doing the Unlovable vultures. And then on Thursday mornings, I'm also doing one which is focused more on teaching with technology. So it's not as wildlife focused, but it's more on how you can use technology in your classroom or in remote distance learning. So this week in 2 days, I'm doing using live webcams to study animal behavior. And then next Thursday, we're doing citizen science and how to use citizen science with your classroom. There's a link down there where you can link to register. You can also get to it from the Focus Wild website. It's also going to be included in some emails that you get following up. So that'll all be coming up. With that, I'm going to leave this slide up. There's my contact information. The email is the easiest way to get a hold of me. So if you have questions that I don't get to in the next couple minutes, or you need to jet out of here, go ahead and write that email down and send me an email. I'll try to respond in the next as soon as I can. If you don't have any questions or you don't want to stick around for the questions, that's perfectly fine. When you log out, hopefully you'll get a survey. If the survey doesn't come through, that's fine. Just don't worry about it. And then within an hour or so, you should get a follow-up, an automated email. So let me go through and start to sift through some of these questions that came through. So you have to excuse me as I kind of go through here a minute. And again, if you still have questions, that's fine. Renee asked, I wonder what the unpopularity survey would show today. This was the one back in where we were talking about the people that ranked coyotes below cockroaches, and that's an interesting one. It would be an interesting. I don't know, that was an older survey. I don't think it's been done recently. I'm sure there's been versions of it. That would actually be an interesting study for students to put together. They could do a relatively somewhat scientific study on that one. Would be a good way to look at that. Renee also said they use irrigation ditches and bridle paths to get around in the large lot houses in Glendale. They absolutely do. So one of the things that we tell people a lot of times too, whether it's coyotes, whether it's mountain lions or whatever, if they're coming into your neighborhood, they're often using those washes as a way to move. And a lot of that is because some of those washes aren't maintained, and so they can get a lot of shelter and cover in those washes. So if there's a problem with these types of animals coming into neighborhoods through these washes, one of the things that we will tell people is to clear out those washes and make sure that the animals aren't comfortable going through them. If they're going to be seen in those washes, then it's going to be a little bit more useful for them. Penny asked, what is the biological mechanism that causes larger litters when they're colonizing new areas? I've also heard this happens if pressure put on an existing population, but I'm not clear physiologically what causes litter size to increase. That's a good question, Penny, and I'm not entirely sure. I should have said at the beginning, I am by no means a coyote expert. I'm not a coyote biologist. I'm an educator. trying to interpret some of the information to you guys and get some of this information out there. I don't know the physiological mechanism behind it. I just know that it happened, and it's under two circumstances you talked about. So it is in colonizing. So when they get into a new area, they can reproduce very quickly and they can have lots of babies and push it forward. And then also when they're under pressure, they start to have more babies. And so those are the two conditions that we've seen that keep them in sort of this constant colonization set. I'm not sure. We might not know what it is. We just know that it happens, and that's what we're seeing. So I apologize, I can't do more than that. Have seen evidence on the internet game cams of coyotes and badgers hanging together at night. Any evidence of cooperative hunting? That I'm not aware of. It's not uncommon we're finding now more and more that we're finding these unusual relationships that animals have that you sometimes wouldn't think. We have camera footage on one of our videos that the Game and Fish produces of a pack rat actually sharing a den with a rattlesnake. And that you would be completely that's not intuitive at all, because the pack rat could be eaten by the rattlesnake, but they're actually using it at different times. It's these weird relationships, and I'm sure we see some of that. I'm not sure if the coyotes and badgers are working together, or it just so happens that they're utilizing the resources. Web cameras are often set up in a source where there's going to be it's going to be a resource-rich environment that's going to draw animals in, oftentimes over a watering hole or something like that. So there may be another factor involved. I don't know if there's specific evidence of them working with other animals. Let's see. Renee said she added a horse to the goat herd, and that started taking care of the coyote attacks. Why is there no effective way? Oops, hang on here. Just lost my questions. Why is there no effective way for non-consumptive users to financially support AZGFD so that our majority voices will be heard and lead policy? So there are. This is an interesting question, Matt, and I'm glad you asked. I'm not sure I have a lot of time to answer it to the detail. This is something that the department struggles with, right? So up to this point, hunters and anglers have been the majority funders of the department because they're the ones that purchase licenses. We have been experimenting, obviously, with other ways for that funding model to change a little bit, because as hunting and fishing becomes a lower and lower part of the population, it's just that less people are getting outdoors, less people are hunting, less people are fishing. That becomes a concern for the future of wildlife management if we can't fund them through other ways. We do have some options for that to happen. Obviously, though I didn't mention it here, but the program, this Focus Wild Arizona, the wildlife education program, is supported through it's entirely funded through the state lottery, so buying lottery tickets helps. But you can also, we have a conservation membership program that you can actually join. If you go to azwildlifehero.com, you can actually learn how to support us in other ways other than hunting and fishing. Obviously, you do bring up an interesting point: is where does that voice get heard? Obviously, as the funding model shifts, as non-consumptive users, non-hunters, non-anglers become a greater share of the funding source, their voice is going to get louder. That's just a reality of the economics. Until that happens, there's going to be some issues with the voice speaking there. I'd be happy to talk with you more about that. I just don't want to spend a ton of time on that. Let me see. Can adult female coyotes reproduce annually, unlike the wolf, where just the alpha female reproduces? In general, and I kind of hinted at this a little bit in the earlier presentation, in general, if there's a pack, the alpha female is going to be the one that reproduces. However, if the alpha female is killed, the younger ones can go into estrus, and they will go into estrus, and they can start reproducing as well. But under most circumstances, I believe that the younger ones typically are kept under control a little bit. All right, I got some more questions here. Let me make sure that I haven't missed any here. Again, if you're fine, you're free to go. I appreciate you for coming out. Let me just see what we've got here. People have been having some sound problems. Again, if you had some sound problems, this was being recorded, and it'll be available to you future. Suzanne clarifies a point that I made. Wolves may have been tamed by native people, but not domesticated. And she's right, they weren't domesticated, but they actually did hybridize a lot of times. So sometimes they would take their dogs and they would hybridize with wolves, but they didn't do that very often with coyotes. Would love to know where you're getting your stats. We talked about that. I'm going to provide a lot of those resources and references on that website. How do we know Taylor Mitchell died from a coyote attack as opposed to coyotes simply scavenging her body? Good question from Matt. So animals kill in different ways, right? And so typically we can look at a kill. It's not always clear, but typically we can look at a kill and we can know whether it was done by a bear, a lion, a coyote, a wolf, just in the way that they attack, the way that the kill structure takes place. And in that one, I'm pretty sure that they've confirmed that that one has a coyote. And then, I think the issue is that they might be concerned that it was actually not just one coyote, but it might have been a pack of coyotes that took her down. And that was the thing about it when they found her body. It was not just this concern that there were a bunch of coyotes scavenging on it, but that might have been a group of coyotes that actually had been involved in killing her, as opposed to just an individual one. So we can off. It's not 100%, but we have a pretty good way of telling how the attack happened, what part of the body they used to attack, what part of the body did they attack, how was it taken down, the teeth, the pattern, the dental structure, those types of things can tell us a lot about which animal killed it, how big the bite mark was, those different types of things. Julie mentions she saw a PBS program on the hybrid coy wolves. That was something that we were going to talk about, but obviously I don't have a ton of time. The coy wolves are an interesting situation. There's a lot of research coming out there. This has to do a lot with the evolution of the wolves and the coyotes, which we only touched on briefly. The red wolves play a role in that. This idea of a hybridized coyote and wolf may or may not be. We know it's a thing, but now the question is, has it always been around? And is the coy wolf actually one of these species? Like there's talk about whether the red wolf may actually be a hybridized coyote and wolf. And not the separate wolf species that we've been talking about. What's interesting is we don't have a lot of evidence of hybridization occurring in the Southwest. So for whatever reason, coyotes don't seem to be breeding with the Mexican gray wolves. And there's a lot of speculation on what that might mean, but a lot of it seems to be that they, compared to what we're seeing in the East Coast and in the Southeast, where we have seen that hybridization, we don't really see it occurring here. There isn't a lot of documented evidence of coyotes and Mexican gray wolves hybridizing. So I don't have as much information on that. Wildlife management begins with human management, especially government agencies such as Wildlife Services, which continually changes its name to a more friendly tone while slaughtering wildlife in the millions. So Matt, yes, in some of my other presentations, there's two things that I say about wildlife management. Wildlife management is much more about managing people than it is about managing wildlife. That's absolutely what I believe. And the other thing is wildlife management is not the same as wildlife science. So we can know everything there is to know about an animal, but we have to manage that animal in the real world today. And that does involve people as well. So absolutely, you are correct that there is a human element to that. Does the Game and Fish Department provide water to coyotes? As far as I know, we aren't out there providing water specifically to coyotes. We do have water sources out in remote areas where there used to be water sources but aren't anymore because of human activities, whether it's damming or pumping or whatever it might be. And those are often provided for other sources like deer and bighorn sheep and things like that. Coyotes obviously can utilize that and take advantage of that, but I don't believe we're putting out water specifically for coyotes to feed. Where do you access the recordings of these? So there's going to be two ways to do this. It takes about a day or two to process through the Cisco server, which is the WebEx, which is the company that hosts the webinars. And that'll be sort of the unedited version, just as you heard it here today. And then usually over the next month or so, what I will do is I'm actually going to go back and edit this recording, not to take out important content, but to take out the stuff that's a little more timely. Like I'm going to take out the references to the workshops because those are specific to something that's coming up next week, for example. And then I post the edited versions to our website so that they can be viewed at any time. So I take off some of the stuff that's not as relevant. I'm going to edit it down, and that becomes available anytime on our website. But if you absolutely need the recording, send me an email, and I'll make sure that you get a link to it if it's not automatically sent to you. Still have a few more questions. Again, if you're done, feel free to leave. Do we know how many coyotes are in Pima County, or are they increasing? That I don't know. We don't really survey for coyotes in the same level that we do for some other animals, simply because at this time there's not a concern for their population being in danger. Are they increasing? I don't know. They're at least probably remaining stable. We're not having concerns about coyote populations being too small. Victoria talked about Nixon a little bit. Now, Nixon wasn't perfect. He did some stuff for the environmental movement. Obviously, a lot of it was done for political reasons because he thought he could gain support. He also did some things that weren't positive for the environment. And from Nixon through to even today, that there's back and forth policies. Things that one president did gets pulled off from by another president, gets added on, and there's not consistency among presidents oftentimes. But yeah, there is some stuff that Nixon was able to do. How is the coyote population maintained today? We're not taking a lot of active measures to make sure that they continue to increase. I can tell you that many people will believe that coyotes are a pest, and that still contains today. They do have to be managed in a way that if they do become aggressive, we do need to remove them, and usually a removal means a lethal removal. Simply because when you relocate them to another location, you're not really solving the problem. You're putting them in another animal's territory, and they're going to fight, and that could cause more problems. And also, there's not a lot of places that need coyotes. So one solution is always, oh, let's just put them in a zoo or a place like that. The problem is that coyotes are kind of a dime a dozen, that everybody's got them and nobody really needs them. And so a lot of zoos aren't going to voluntarily take another animal that they need to take care of and feed and get money for to take care of when they already got their share of them. So it's not as simple as just sending them somewhere. So unfortunately, a removal does often mean a lethal removal. Not all the time, but oftentimes it does. All right. I don't have a population estimate of populations in Arizona. Sorry. And then Kathy mentions ASU has a great study of coyotes in Phoenix urban areas. They have trail cameras set up at many places throughout the city. I believe I have information for that. That I'll probably link to as well. So with that, I'm going to scan through here again. I'm probably going to mute my microphone for a minute or so to make sure there's any more questions. But if you don't have anything else, again, feel free to leave. I'm going to stay on for another minute or two as I monitor questions coming through. Thank you, guys.